My name is Jessica Carter, and 5 years ago, my parents stood in a parking lot and laughed while I carried my entire life into a storage unit. Not an apartment, not a tiny house, a storage unit. And the crazy part? They still tell people they don't know why I stopped talking to them. See, if you'd asked my family back then, they would have told you I was the dramatic one, the difficult daughter, the one who couldn't be happy for other people's success, especially my brother Brandon's. Now, Brandon was 3 years older than me and had spent most of his life failing upward. You know those people? The kind who somehow crash every car, lose every job, and burn through every opportunity, yet always land on their feet because somebody else catches them. That was Brandon. Every single time. And the people doing the catching were always my parents. Growing up, the rules were different for us. If Brandon got into trouble, he needed support. If I got into trouble, I needed a life lesson. Big difference. I learned that early. By the time I was 12, I already knew who mattered most in our house. And spoiler alert, it wasn't me. But I kept trying anyway. Because that's what kids do. You keep thinking maybe this time will be different. Maybe this birthday. Maybe this graduation. Maybe this achievement. Maybe this accomplishment. Maybe this time they'll finally notice. Man, I spent years chasing that maybe. Years. And every single time, Brandon somehow became the main character again. By 23, I was exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. I was tired of competing in a race I never signed up for. Tired of being responsible. Tired of hearing the same phrase over and over. Jessica, you're stronger than your brother. Sounds like a compliment, right? It's not. Not when people use it as an excuse to never show up for you. Because every time they said I was strong, what they really meant was, we don't have to help you. And every time they said Brandon was struggling, what they really meant was, we're giving him everything again. I didn't realize how bad things had gotten until the day my landlord knocked on my apartment door. I still remember it. Thursday afternoon, rain coming down. Rent increase notice in his hand. My stomach dropped before he even spoke. The building had been sold. New owners, new prices. My rent was about to jump almost 50%. I stood there staring at the paper like maybe the numbers would change if I looked long enough. They didn't. I couldn't afford it. Not even close. At the time, I was working 2 jobs and trying to save every dollar I could. I had a dream. A boring dream. Not a fancy one. Not a social media dream. I wanted financial freedom. That's it. I wanted to own property someday. I wanted security. I wanted a life where one unexpected bill couldn't destroy everything. So when the rent increase came, I had a choice. Spend everything trying to survive, or sacrifice comfort for a bigger goal. I chose the second option. At first, everybody thought I was kidding. Then they thought I was crazy. Then they started laughing. The storage facility rented converted workspaces. Tiny. Legal. Cheap. A roof. Electricity. Internet. Enough room for a mattress. Not glamorous. Not pretty. But it would let me save thousands of dollars. And I had a plan. A real one. The problem was, nobody cared about the plan. They only cared about how it looked. Especially my family. When I told my parents what I was doing, there was a long silence. Then Brandon started laughing. Not a little laugh. A full laugh. The kind that makes you realize somebody genuinely thinks you're a joke. My mom wasn't much better. Jessica, honey, she said. You can't seriously live in a storage unit. I explained everything. The savings, the investment goals, the long-term strategy, the math, the opportunity. None of it mattered. Because people only respect sacrifices after they work. Before they work, they call them mistakes. The day I moved in, my family actually came to watch. Looking back, that should have told me everything. Nobody drives across town to support someone moving into a storage unit. They came for entertainment. Brandon pulled out his phone. Dad shook his head. Mom looked embarrassed, like I was ruining the family brand. Then Brandon snapped a picture. Me carrying boxes, standing outside that unit, trying to build something better, and he posted it online. The caption? My sister really downgraded to living in a closet. People loved it. Likes, comments, laughing emojis. The whole thing. I won't lie, that one hurt. Not because strangers laughed. Who cares about strangers? It hurt because my family joined in. The people who were supposed to believe in me. The people who should have had my back. Instead, they turned me into a punchline. That night I sat alone on a folding chair inside that storage unit. One lamp, one mattress, a couple boxes. That's it. I looked around at everything I owned. And for a second, just a second, I wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I was making a huge mistake. Maybe everybody else knew something I didn't. Then I opened my savings spreadsheet, looked at my numbers, looked at my plan, and I remembered something important. Every person laughing at me had spent their entire lives making decisions based on appearances. I was making decisions based on outcomes. Big difference. So I shut the door, locked it, sat down on that mattress, and made myself a promise. One day, I was going to build something nobody could laugh at. What I didn't know was that 5 years later, those same people would stand inside a building I owned, staring at me like they were looking at a stranger, and asking for help. But before that happened, my family's biggest mistake was still coming. If you ask my parents today, they'd probably tell you they loved Brandon and me exactly the same, and maybe they even believe that. But here's the thing. Kids don't listen to what parents say. They watch what parents do, and what my parents did made it pretty clear where I stood. I wasn't the favorite. Not even close. I was the backup plan, the responsible one. The kid they never worried about because they were too busy worrying about Brandon. Now, Brandon wasn't a bad person, at least not back then. That's important. He wasn't some movie villain twirling a mustache. He was just a guy who spent his entire life getting rescued. And eventually, being rescued became his personality. The first time I noticed the difference between us, I was 10. Brandon was 13. He'd gotten suspended from school for fighting. Again, I remember sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when my parents got home from the principal's office. I expected yelling, grounding, consequences. You know, parent stuff. Instead, my mom hugged him. My dad blamed the other kid. And somehow Brandon ended up getting pizza for dinner because he'd had a stressful day. Meanwhile, 3 weeks earlier, I'd gotten grounded for getting a B in math. No joke. A B. That was the moment I started noticing the pattern. And once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. Over the years, it happened again, and again, and again. When Brandon wrecked his first car at 17, my parents bought him another one. When I wanted help paying for college applications, I got a lecture about responsibility. When Brandon quit his job after 3 weeks because his manager was annoying, my parents supported his decision. When I worked double shifts during summer break, nobody even asked how I was doing. I became invisible, not because they hated me, because they expected me to handle everything myself. And honestly, that might have hurt worse. At least if someone dislikes you, they're paying attention. Being ignored is different. Being ignored feels like you don't matter enough to disappoint. By the time I graduated high school, Brandon was already living at home. No job, no plan, no direction. Just ideas. Lots and lots of ideas. Every month there was a new dream. New business. New opportunity. New shortcut to success. 1 month it was fitness coaching. The next month it was cryptocurrency. Then online marketing. Then custom sneakers. Then sports betting. Every idea was supposed to make him rich. Every idea failed. And every failure somehow became someone else's fault. The market. The economy. His partners. Bad timing. Mercury being in retrograde. Man, I heard every excuse in the book. The one thing Brandon never blamed? Himself. And my parents helped him do it. Every single time. Meanwhile, I was busting my butt trying to build an actual future. Community college. Part-time jobs. Side gigs. Saving every dollar I could. I wasn't looking for a miracle. I was looking for stability. Turns out stability isn't very exciting. Nobody throws parties for stability. Nobody posts motivational quotes about stability. But stability changes your life. Slowly, quietly, permanently. The older I got, the more obvious the difference became. Brandon got chances. I got expectations. Brandon got forgiveness. I got responsibility. Brandon got support. I got advice. Big difference. One costs money. The other costs nothing. And every year that gap got wider. Then came my 22nd birthday. A day I'll never forget. Mostly because nobody else remembered it. Seriously, nobody. Not one person in my family called. Not my mom. Not my dad. Not Brandon. Nobody. I spent the day working. Came home. Ordered cheap takeout. Watched a movie by myself. And around 10 that night, my phone finally buzzed. Mom. For a second, I smiled. Then I answered. And you know what she said? Not happy birthday. Not even close. The first words out of her mouth were, Jessica, can you lend Brandon $300? $300. That was the call. The entire reason she reached out. I remember sitting there in silence, trying to process what I'd just heard. Finally, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Mom actually sounded confused. What's so funny? I wanted to tell her. I wanted to tell her that she'd forgotten my birthday. Again, I wanted to tell her how much it hurt, how tired I was, how invisible I felt. But something stopped me. Maybe pride, Maybe exhaustion. Maybe both. Instead, I just said, "No, Mom, I can't." And I hung up. That night changed something. Not all at once, but it started a crack. A tiny crack in the version of my family I'd been carrying around my whole life. The version where if I worked hard enough, succeeded enough, helped enough, they'd finally see me. Because deep down, I still believed that. Crazy, right? After everything, I still thought maybe one day I'd earn the same love Brandon got for free. But love doesn't work that way. You shouldn't have to earn a seat at your own family's table. And slowly, painfully, I was starting to understand that. Then Brandon came to my apartment one afternoon with the biggest smile I'd ever seen. He looked excited, confident, like he'd finally figured life out. I should have known trouble was coming. Because whenever Brandon got excited, someone else's bank account usually suffered. And this time, the account he had his eyes on wasn't mine. It was my parents'. And what happened next would change all of our lives. A week after Brandon showed up grinning like he'd cracked the code to life, my parents invited me over for dinner. The second I walked in, I knew something was up. Brandon was practically vibrating with excitement. Halfway through dinner, he stood up and announced his newest business idea. A sports bar. Not a small one. A huge downtown sports bar with giant screens, expensive equipment, and a premium location. There was only one problem. Brandon had no money, no experience, and no business plan. Just confidence. Lots of confidence. Then my dad smiled. "We've decided to invest." Everyone looked happy except me. "How much?" I asked. My mom glanced at my dad. Then she said it. "Most of our retirement savings." I almost dropped my fork. "What?" Dad laughed. "You have to take risks sometimes." I looked at Brandon. He already looked like he'd won the lottery. "Have you even run a business before?" I asked. His smile faded. Mom immediately jumped in. "Jessica, be supportive." Supportive. That word again. Whenever Brandon made bad decisions, everyone else was supposed to be supportive. A few months later, the sports bar opened. And for about 3 weeks, Brandon acted like a celebrity. Social media posts, champagne photos, motivational quotes. The whole thing. Then reality showed up. Customers stopped coming. Bills piled up. Rent was insane. Staff kept quitting. Within 10 months, the business was dead. Completely dead. The retirement savings? Gone. Every dollar. My parents were devastated. Brandon? He blamed the economy. I wish I was kidding. And somehow, after losing everything, my parents still acted like Brandon was the victim. That was the moment I realized something. No matter how many times he failed, they would always rescue him. And sooner or later, they were going to expect me to help rescue all of them. A few months after Brandon's sports bar crashed, my parents' finances were a mess. Credit cards were maxed out. Savings were gone. Bills kept showing up, and right on schedule. My phone started ringing. "Mom. Dad." Mom again. At first, they called to vent. Then they called for advice. Then they called for money. I saw it coming a mile away. One Sunday afternoon, my parents invited me over. The second I sat down, I knew this wasn't a family visit. It was an ambush. My mom started softly. "Jessica, we're going through a hard time." Dad nodded. "We need family to stick together." There it was. The setup. Then came the ask. "Could I help with a few bills? Maybe just until things got better." I looked around the room. The same room where every sacrifice had always been for Brandon. The same room where my dreams had always come second. And suddenly I felt tired. Not angry. Just tired. I asked one question. "Has Brandon helped at all?" Silence. That told me everything. My mom immediately got defensive. "He's struggling too." Of course he was. He was always struggling. Always the victim. Always the emergency. I took a deep breath. Then I said something my family wasn't used to hearing. "No." The room froze. Mom blinked. Dad stared, like I'd spoken another language. "No?" Mom repeated. "No," I said calmly. "I spent years watching you give him everything. I'm not paying for his mistakes." My mother's face turned red. After everything they'd done for me. After all their sacrifices. After all their support. Support? That almost made me laugh. But I didn't. I simply stood up. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to win the argument. I wasn't trying to be understood. I was done auditioning for approval. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. Behind me, my mom shouted, "You're being selfish, Jessica." I stopped, turned around, and said the one thing I'd wanted to say for years. "No, Mom. I'm just done being the backup plan." Then I walked out. And for the first time in my life, I didn't look back. What I didn't know was that leaving emotionally would be easy. A few months later, I'd be forced to leave physically too, and that decision would change everything. 6 months after moving into the storage unit, I finally had enough savings to make my first investment. Nothing huge, nothing flashy, just a small run-down condo on the edge of town. Most people wouldn't have looked at it twice. The paint was peeling, the carpets were stained, and the previous owner wanted out fast. To me, it looked like opportunity. I emptied almost everything I'd saved and bought it. Not gonna lie, signing those papers was terrifying. One bad decision and I'd lose everything. But for the first time in years, I was betting on myself. Not Brandon, not my parents, me. For the next 3 months, every free hour went into that condo. After work, I'd drive over and start fixing things. Painting walls, replacing fixtures, cleaning, learning everything from YouTube videos and trial and error. It wasn't glamorous. Most nights I got home exhausted. But every improvement made the place worth a little more. And that kept me going. Finally, it was ready. I listed it for rent. Then I waited, and waited, and waited. The first week, nothing. Second week, nothing. By week 3, I was starting to panic. Then one Saturday morning, my phone rang. A young nurse looking for a place close to work. She toured the condo that afternoon and signed the lease the same day. I remember sitting in my car afterward just smiling. Not because I got rich, because it worked. My plan actually worked. For the first time, money was coming in whether I was working or not. That feeling hit different. The rent wasn't huge, but it was proof. Proof that I didn't need permission. Proof that I didn't need my family's approval. Proof that I could build something on my own. A few weeks later, I drove past my parents' house. Brandon's car was parked outside. Again, still living there. Still talking about his next big opportunity. And for the first time, I didn't feel jealous. I felt free. Because while Brandon was chasing shortcuts, I was building foundations. And foundations last longer. What I didn't know was that this little condo was only the beginning. Because over the next few years, 1 property would become 2. Then 4. Then 10. And eventually, something much bigger. The funny thing about success is that nobody notices it when it's happening. They only notice it after it's already happened. For the next 4 years, my life was pretty boring, at least from the outside. Wake up, go to work, save money, buy property. Repeat. No luxury vacations, no designer bags, no social media flexing. While everyone else was trying to look rich, I was trying to become rich. Big difference. The rent from my first condo helped me buy a second property. The second helped me buy a third. Then a duplex. Then another condo. Then a small 4-unit building. Every time I got extra income, I reinvested it. Every single dollar. Not gonna lie, there were moments when I wanted to quit. Property repairs, bad tenants, unexpected expenses. 1 year, a water pipe burst in the middle of winter and wiped out months of profit overnight. I sat in my car afterward and laughed, because at that point, crying would have taken too much energy. But I kept going. Because unlike Brandon's business ideas, my plan wasn't built on excitement. It was built on patience. And patience pays. Slowly, then all at once. By the time I turned 28, I owned 11 rental units. 11. Sometimes I'd look at the numbers and have trouble believing them myself. Meanwhile, Brandon was still chasing shortcuts. Every family gathering brought a new, life-changing opportunity. Crypto, day trading, online coaching, sports betting, you name it. Nothing lasted. Nothing worked. And somehow every failure was still somebody else's fault. The crazy part? My parents kept funding him, even after everything they'd lost. They never learned. And honestly, that wasn't my problem anymore. I stopped arguing, stopped explaining, stopped trying to save people who didn't want to be saved. I focused on my own lane. Then one afternoon, a realtor called me about an off-market opportunity, an aging apartment building downtown. 48 units. Most investors passed on it. Too expensive, too much work, too many problems. When I toured it, the place looked rough. Old carpets, broken fixtures, outdated everything. But underneath all that, I saw potential. The same way I saw potential in that first condo. The same way nobody saw potential in me. 6 months later, after the biggest financial risk of my life, I became the owner of a 48-unit apartment building. I remember standing in the lobby after renovations were finished. Fresh paint, new floors, new lighting. Families moving in. People starting new chapters of their lives. And for a moment, I thought about that storage unit. The one everyone laughed at. The one people called pathetic. Turns out it was the smartest decision I'd ever made. Because while my family was busy judging where I lived, I was building something they never imagined possible. And then one morning my phone rang. The screen showed my mother's name. Something told me this wasn't a social call. And unfortunately, I was right. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was reviewing renovation invoices when my phone lit up. Mom. For a second, I thought about letting it go to voicemail. Not because I was angry, because I already knew this wasn't a "how are you" call. After years of experience, I could spot a problem before she even spoke. I answered anyway. "Hey, Mom." Her voice was unusually sweet. That should have been my first warning. "Jessica, sweetheart, how have you been?" There it was. The fake small talk. The warm-up act. I leaned back in my chair. "What do you need?" Silence. Then a nervous laugh. "Why would you think I need something?" "Because you never call otherwise." I didn't say that out loud. A few seconds later, she finally got to the point. Brandon was in trouble. Again. Big surprise. This time, he'd invested nearly everything he had into a cryptocurrency project one of his friends recommended. And just like every other can't-miss opportunity in Brandon's life, it crashed. Hard. Gone. Money gone. Savings gone. Credit cards maxed out. The whole thing. I rubbed my forehead. "How bad is it?" Another pause. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "They might lose the house." The house. The same house I'd grown up in. The same house my parents had spent 30 years paying off. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Not because I was shocked. Because deep down, I'd always known this day might come. You can only keep rescuing bad decisions for so long before they drag you under, too. Mom kept talking. About stress. About bills. About how difficult things had become. Then she finally asked the real question. "Do you know anybody renting?" There it was. The reason for the call, not to reconnect, not to apologize, not to check on me. They needed help. Again, I stared out the office window toward the apartment building parking lot below. Tenants coming and going, kids riding bikes, people living their lives. And suddenly a thought hit me. A weird one. Because technically, I did know somebody renting. Me. I owned 48 apartments. My mom had absolutely no idea. Neither did Brandon. Neither did Dad. They still thought I was doing okay. They had no clue how much my life had changed. I asked a simple question. How many people need a place? Mom sounded relieved. Just us. Us, meaning all three of them. Of course. I almost laughed. After everything that had happened, life had somehow brought us right back here. Only this time the roles were different. For years they'd looked down on me. Now they needed something I had, and they didn't even know it yet. So I made a decision. A calm one. A smart one. I told Mom there might be an option. A really good option. But they'd have to come see it first. The excitement in her voice was immediate. "Oh, Jessica, thank you." Funny. She sounded grateful before she'd even seen the place. Before she'd even asked who owned it. Before she realized exactly whose door she was about to walk through. We scheduled a visit for Saturday. After hanging up, I sat quietly for a minute. Then I smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't nervous about seeing my family. I was curious. And deep down, I couldn't help wondering how Brandon would react when he discovered that the sister he laughed at for living in a storage unit owned the entire building. Saturday arrived faster than I expected. At exactly 11 o'clock, my phone buzzed. "Mom, we're here." I looked out the office window and immediately spotted them. Mom, Dad, and Brandon, standing in front of the building. All three staring up at it. Not gonna lie, that felt surreal. 5 years earlier, they were laughing at me for living in a storage unit. Now they were standing outside a property worth millions. And they had no idea who owned it. I walked downstairs and met them in the lobby. The second mom stepped inside, her eyes widened. "Wow." Dad slowly nodded. "This place is nice." Brandon looked around at the marble floors and modern lighting. For once in his life, he didn't have anything smart to say. I almost enjoyed that. Almost. We started the tour. I showed them the fitness center, the courtyard, the rooftop lounge, the renovated apartments. The whole time, they kept talking about how lucky the owner must be. That word. Lucky. People love calling success luck when they didn't see the years of work behind it. Mom smiled. "Whoever owns this really hit the jackpot." I nearly laughed. "Jackpot? Sure. If you call 5 years of sacrifice, stress, and 80-hour work weeks a jackpot." We stopped on the rooftop overlooking downtown. The view was incredible. Even Brandon seemed impressed. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "So who's the owner?" There it was. The moment. the question that had been slowly moving toward me all morning. I took a sip of coffee, stayed calm, and pointed toward myself. You're looking at her. Silence. Real silence. The kind that hits like a brick. Mom blinked. Dad froze. Brandon actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because he thought I was joking. Then he realized I wasn't, and the look on his face, priceless. What? He said. I smiled. I own the building. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, nobody said a word. The entire tour suddenly made sense. The private access, the staff greeting me by name, the office, everything. Mom looked completely stunned. Dad looked like somebody had unplugged him. And Brandon? He looked like he was trying to solve a math problem. Finally, Mom spoke. You own all of this? I nodded. All 48 units. The shock on their faces told me everything. For years, they'd assumed I was barely getting by. They never asked, never checked, never cared enough to know. And now they were standing inside proof of everything they'd missed. The crazy part? The reveal wasn't even the best part. Because a few minutes later, Brandon said something that proved he still hadn't learned a thing. And that's when the visit went from awkward to unforgettable. For a few seconds after I told them I owned the building, nobody said a word. Mom looked stunned. Dad looked confused. And Brandon looked offended. Not impressed, not proud, offended. Like my success had somehow happened to him. Then he laughed. A short, awkward laugh. Okay, seriously. Who owns it? I stared at him. I do. His smile disappeared. The reality finally landed. And honestly, that should have been the end of it. But Brandon couldn't help himself. He never could. Instead of congratulating me, he crossed his arms and said, So how much help did you get? I blinked. What? You know, he said. Investors, partners, somebody backing you. There it was. The reason some people never grow. They can't accept that somebody else succeeded through hard work. There always has to be a shortcut, a secret, a lucky break, anything except effort. I looked him straight in the eye. Nobody helped me. The rooftop went quiet. Mom shifted uncomfortably. Dad looked away. Because deep down, they knew exactly what I meant. Nobody helped me. Not when I moved into a storage unit. Not when I worked double shifts. Not when I bought my first property. Not when pipes burst at 3 a.m. Not when I spent weekends painting walls instead of going out with friends. Nobody. Brandon scoffed. I find that hard to believe. For the first time all day, I felt something. Not anger, disappointment. Because even now, even after seeing the building, even after seeing the results, he still couldn't imagine a world where I earned it. Mom jumped in quickly. Brandon, stop! Then she turned to me. Honey, we're proud of you. The words should have felt good. Instead, they felt late. Years late. I smiled politely. Really? Mom nodded. Of course. I looked at her. Then at Dad. Then back at Brandon. And before I could stop myself, I asked a question. Do you remember the storage unit? Nobody answered. Of course they remembered. Mom looked down. Dad suddenly became very interested in the skyline. Brandon rolled his eyes. That told me everything. So I kept going. Do you remember the picture? Still silence. The one Brandon posted online. Mom looked embarrassed. Dad looked guilty. And Brandon? He shrugged. Like it wasn't a big deal. Like humiliating me was just another Tuesday. I laughed softly. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. 5 years later, and he still didn't get it. Then I said something I'd been carrying for years. You all laughed at me when I was trying to build my future. Nobody spoke. You saw sacrifice and called it failure. Still nothing. You saw discipline and called it desperation. Now even Brandon looked uncomfortable. Good. About time. Then Mom reached for my hand. Jessica. I pulled it back. Not dramatically, just calmly. And for the first time they realized something. The girl who spent her whole life chasing their approval, she was gone. That version of me didn't exist anymore. The rooftop suddenly felt very quiet. Then Brandon opened his mouth again. And somehow, he made everything worse. The rooftop was completely silent. For a moment, I thought Brandon might actually let it go. I should have known better. He crossed his arms and shook his head. Then he said the dumbest thing possible. You're acting like you're better than us. There it was. Not congratulations. Not accountability. Not self-reflection. Just jealousy. I stared at him. That's what you got from this? Brandon threw his hands up. Come on, Jessica. You own a building now. Big deal. Big deal. I almost laughed. 5 years earlier, I was sleeping on a mattress in a storage unit. Now I owned 48 apartments. And somehow that was no big deal. Mom jumped in. "Brandon, stop." But he was already rolling. The thing about people who spend their lives being rescued is they panic when nobody rescues them. And Brandon was panicking. "You got lucky," he snapped. Lucky, that word again. The favorite excuse of people who don't want to admit somebody worked harder than they did. I took a deep breath. Then I asked him one question. "How many nights did you spend sleeping in a storage unit?" Silence. "How many jobs did you work?" Nothing. "How many properties did you renovate yourself?" Still nothing, because we both knew the answer. 0. Dad finally spoke. "Brandon." But Brandon wasn't listening anymore. Years of entitlement were spilling out all at once. "You think you're some kind of success story now?" The crazy part? I didn't even feel angry. I just felt tired. Tired of the excuses. Tired of the victim act. Tired of watching the same movie over and over. Then Mom surprised me. For the first time in my life, she turned toward Brandon instead of me. And she said, "Enough." The rooftop went quiet again. Brandon looked shocked. Honestly, so did I. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears. Real ones, the kind people cry when they finally see something they've been avoiding for years. Then she looked at me. "Jessica, we should have been there for you." I didn't know what to say. Because for years I'd imagined hearing those words. And now that they were finally here, they didn't fix anything. Some wounds are too old for that. Dad looked down. I should have done better too. For a second, nobody moved. The wind blew across the rooftop. The city hummed below us. And for the first time in years, everyone was telling the truth. No excuses, no pretending, just truth. Then Brandon broke the moment. Again, he shook his head and muttered, "Whatever." And that's when I knew. Mom and Dad might change, but Brandon wouldn't. At least not today, maybe not ever, because growth starts with accountability, and Brandon still thought everyone else was the problem. A few minutes later, he stormed toward the elevator. Mom followed. Dad lingered behind. Then he looked at me and quietly said, "I'm proud of you, Jess." Not because he wanted something. Not because he needed help. Just because he meant it. And somehow, that hit harder than anything else. But the biggest decision was still ahead of me. Because despite everything that happened, my family still needed a place to live. And now I had to decide what came next. 12. The drive home from the rooftop was quiet. For them. For me. For everyone. Years of tension. Years of disappointment. Years of pretending. All of it had finally been dragged into the light. And honestly, I felt lighter. Not because I'd won, because I was finally done carrying it. A few days later, Mom called. This time, the conversation was different. No guilt trips, no manipulation, no talking about Brandon. Just honesty. She apologized. Really apologized. Not the fake kind. Not the "I'm sorry you feel that way" kind. An actual apology. The kind I'd waited years to hear. I listened. Then I thanked her. Because forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing. I could forgive her. That didn't mean everything magically went back to normal. Some bridges take years to rebuild, and some never do. A week later, Dad called too. We talked for almost an hour, mostly about ordinary things. Work, life, the future. For the first time in forever, it felt like I was talking to my father instead of someone hiding behind my mother's decisions. As for Brandon, nothing changed. Not at first. He never apologized. Never admitted he was wrong. Never took responsibility. Instead, he kept bouncing between new ideas and new excuses. Same story, different chapter. And you know what? That wasn't my problem anymore. One afternoon, I sat in my office looking over lease agreements when Mom called again. This time it was about the apartment. They wanted to know if the offer still stood. It did. A standard apartment. A standard lease. A standard rent payment. Same rules as everyone else. No discounts. No special treatment. No exceptions. For a moment, there was silence. Then Mom said something I never expected. "That's fair?" Fair. Funny word. For most of my life, fair had never been part of our family vocabulary. But now it was. And that mattered. A month later, my parents moved into one of the units. Nothing fancy. Nothing free. Just a normal apartment. Like everyone else. Watching them carry boxes through the lobby felt strange. 5 years earlier, they'd watched me move into a storage unit. Now I was watching them start over. Life has a funny sense of humor. The difference was, I wasn't laughing. Because struggling isn't funny. Starting over isn't funny. And humiliation isn't funny. I knew that better than anyone. So I helped them carry a few boxes. Not because I owed them, because I wanted to. That's the difference. Real generosity comes from choice, not obligation. As the months passed, things slowly improved. Mom got a part-time job. Dad found contract work. They stabilized. Nothing glamorous. Nothing dramatic. Just steady progress. The kind of progress that actually lasts. Meanwhile, the building kept growing. Occupancy increased. Property values climbed. And I started looking at another investment. Then another. Then another. The funny thing is, success didn't feel the way I thought it would. I always imagined some huge moment, some grand victory, some day where everything suddenly felt complete. That day never came. Instead, success felt quiet, like peace, like waking up without fear, like knowing one emergency couldn't destroy your life, like not needing anyone's approval anymore. That's what freedom felt like. Not money, not buildings, not status. Freedom. About 6 months after moving in, Mom and Dad invited me to dinner. A real dinner. No hidden agenda. No requests. No emergencies. Just dinner. Halfway through the meal, Dad raised his glass. Then he smiled and said, "To Jessica." Everybody looked at me. Even Brandon, who had shown up late. As usual. Dad continued. "The strongest person in this family." Years earlier, hearing that would have hurt. Because strong used to mean being overlooked. Being forgotten. Being expected to survive alone. But not anymore. Now it meant something different. Now it meant resilience, discipline, growth. And for the first time in my life, it felt good. When dinner ended, I walked outside and stood alone for a moment. The city lights stretched across the horizon. The same city where I'd once lived in a storage unit. The same city where people laughed at me. The same city where I quietly built a future while nobody was paying attention. And I realized something. The storage unit was never the embarrassing chapter. It was the beginning, the foundation, the place where everything changed. People thought it was the lowest point of my life. Turns out it was the starting line. And that's the lesson I want you to remember. Sometimes the thing people mock today becomes the thing you're grateful for tomorrow. Sometimes sacrifice looks like failure from the outside. Sometimes the people who underestimate you give you the greatest gift of all. They teach you how to believe in yourself. Because eventually, there comes a day when you stop trying to prove people wrong and start building a life that proves itself. And trust me, that day changes everything. The end. The best revenge isn't making people regret losing you. It's building a life so good that their opinion no longer matters. Alright guys, that's the story. If this story hit different, do me a quick favor. Smash that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. And then let me know in the comments. What would you have done in Jessica's situation? And also, where are you watching from? Drop your city, state, or country below. We're building a family here. So don't be shy. Share your thoughts, your story, or just say hi.